Nathaniel Brennan had stopped counting the days since his daughter died. At 62, retired from the Boston Police Department with a full pension and an empty apartment, he'd learned that grief wasn't something you measured in time. It was something you carried in silence, the way he'd carried his badge for 40 years, close to the chest, never speaking about the weight. 3 months. That's how long Lorelei had been gone when the lawyer's call came. "Mr. Brennan, I'm calling about your daughter's estate. She left you a property in Vermont. A place called Stone Cottage." Nate stared at the whiskey glass in his hand, the amber liquid catching the afternoon light streaming through his kitchen window. Estate. As if a 25-year-old estranged daughter who hadn't spoken to him in 8 years would have an estate. "There must be a mistake," he said. "No mistake, sir. She purchased it 6 months ago, paid cash. $300,000. The glass slipped from Nate's fingers, shattering against the linoleum floor. 300,000. Lorelei worked as a freelance graphic designer, lived in a studio apartment in Portland, drove a 10-year-old Honda. Where the hell did she get that kind of money? "The funds came from a life insurance policy," the lawyer continued, as if reading Nate's mind. "Your late wife, Margaret Brennan, had a $400,000 policy that named Lorelei as sole beneficiary. Your daughter received the payout in 2019 after Mrs. Brennan's passing." Nate's throat tightened. Margaret. She'd left everything to Lorelei. Not to him. To their daughter, who'd stopped speaking to both of them years before Margaret died. "And why Vermont?" Nate asked. She'd never even mentioned Vermont. The lawyer's voice was careful, professional. "I'm afraid I don't have that information, Mr. Brennan. I only handled the property transaction. But she left you a letter along with the deed. It should explain everything." The lawyer's package arrived 3 days after the funeral. Federal Express signature required. Inside was a thick manila envelope containing the deed to Stone Cottage, a set of keys, and a letter in Lorelei's handwriting. Nate sat at his kitchen table for 20 minutes before opening it. The paper was ordinary. Lined notebook paper torn from a spiral binding. Her handwriting hadn't changed since high school. Still the same Lupin letters, the same way she crossed her T's with a little flourish at the end. "Dad, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean much after 8 years of silence, but I need you to know I never stopped loving you. I was just so angry. At you, at Mom, at myself for not being there enough when she needed me. I found something 6 months ago. Something about Mom that she never told us. Something that explains everything. Why she was the way she was. Why she couldn't sleep. Why she'd wake up screaming in the middle of the night. And you'd hold her and she'd cry like a child. I went to Vermont to find the truth. I think I found more than that. I think I found the reason she died the way she did. Not the cancer. The real reason. The thing that was killing her long before the disease took hold. There's a house, Stone Cottage. I bought it with Mom's life insurance money because it's where everything started, where Mom's story began. I've spent the last 6 months documenting what happened there, recording everything, building a case. If something happens to me, finish it. Please. Mom deserves the truth. You deserve the truth. I know you believe in the system, in justice, in doing things the right way. But what if the system is what destroyed her? What if the people who were supposed to protect her were the ones who hurt her the most? Go to the house. Go to the basement. Listen to the tapes. And Dad, I'm sorry I blamed you. You were doing what you thought was right. You always did. I love you. I hope you can forgive me for leaving the way I did. Laura. Nate read the letter 4 times. Each time the words hit harder. Each time the weight in his chest grew heavier. Margaret had secrets. Lorelei had found them. And now Lorelei was dead. The funeral had been small. 14 people in a chapel that could hold 200. Nate sat in the front row, staring at the closed casket, wondering if the last thing his daughter had thought about before the impact was him. Wondering if she'd been angry. Wondering if she'd been scared. The accident report said she'd lost control on a wet road outside Burlington, Vermont. Single vehicle collision. No witnesses. Blood alcohol level 0. No drugs. No phone usage. The investigating officer had been young, maybe 30, with that eager look cops get when they think they're being thorough. Sometimes it just happens, Mr. Brennan. Especially on those mountain roads. 1 second of distraction and Nate had cut him off with a nod. Not because he agreed, but because he recognized the tone. The case-closed voice. The nothing-to-see-here dismissal that civilians accepted without question. But Nate wasn't a civilian. He'd spent 4 decades reading accident reports, crime scenes, autopsy photos. He'd learned to see what other people missed. The inconsistencies, the details that didn't fit. And everything about Lorelei's death felt wrong. After the service, he had gone home to his apartment on Commonwealth Avenue. 4th floor walk-up. Same place he and Margaret had moved into 30 years ago when they were young and broke and stupid enough to think love could fix anything. Margaret. God, he missed her. 5 years gone, and some mornings he still reached for her side of the bed. Still expected to smell coffee brewing in the kitchen. Still turned to tell her something funny before remembering she wasn't there to hear it. Cancer had taken her slowly. Metastatic breast cancer that spread to her bones, her liver, her lungs. 18 months from diagnosis to death. 18 months of watching the woman he loved disappear piece by piece while he sat helpless in a chair beside her hospital bed. Lorelei had been 17 when Margaret died. A senior in high school, already accepted to art school in Rhode Island, already pulling away the way kids do when they're ready to become adults. The funeral had broken something between them. Nate remembered standing at the cemetery watching them lower Margaret's casket into the ground and feeling Lorelei's hand slip into his. She'd squeezed once, hard, like she was trying to transfer her pain through her palm into his body. She waited for you, Lorelei had whispered. Every night, she'd stay awake until she heard your car in the driveway. Even when she could barely keep her eyes open, even when the morphine made her sick, she waited. Nate had squeezed back, throat too tight to speak. You were never there, Dad. The words had hit like a physical blow. Lore, I don't. She'd pulled her hand away. Just don't. That was the last real conversation they'd had. 8 years ago. She'd gone to art school, then Portland, then silence. Birthday cards returned unopened, calls unanswered, emails ignored. Nate had told himself it was grief, that she needed time, that eventually she'd come around. He'd been wrong. Now she was gone and time had run out, and all he had left was a property deed to a house he'd never heard of, and questions that would haunt him until his own casket went into the ground. He stood up, packed a bag, and started driving north. The GPS said 4 hours to Vermont. Nate made it in 3. He drove through Massachusetts, watching the suburbs give way to farmland. The farmland gave way to forest. The leaves were turning brilliant reds and oranges against a gray October sky. Margaret had loved fall. She'd always wanted to buy a place up here somewhere quiet, somewhere they could retire and watch the seasons change without sirens and gunshots and the constant noise of the city. They'd never made it. There was always one more case, one more year until pension, one more reason to stay. And then she was sick, and it was too late for quiet places and fall leaves and all the things they'd promised each other when they were young. Nate's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The exit sign for Millbrook, Vermont appeared just after 2 in the afternoon. Population 3,847. One of those towns that looked like it hadn't changed since 1950. Main Street with a hardware store, a diner, a post office. American flags hanging from every lamppost. A war memorial in the town square, with names carved in granite. Stone Cottage was 6 miles outside town, according to the GPS. Down a 2-lane road that wound through dense forest past old farmhouses and rusted mailboxes and hand-painted signs advertising fresh eggs and firewood. The road narrowed. Paved turned to gravel. Trees pressed close on both sides and their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out the sun. And then, around a sharp curve, there it was. Stone Cottage. Nate pulled his car to a stop at the edge of the circular driveway and sat staring. The house was massive. 3 stories of gray stone and dark wood Victorian architecture, with steep gables and tall, narrow windows. It looked like something out of a Gothic novel. Imposing, austere. The kind of place that had witnessed things it would never speak about. The grounds were overgrown. Weeds choked the flower beds. Vines climbed the stone walls. Their leaves turned crimson with the season. A rusted iron gate hung open on broken hinges. But it was the windows that made Nate's skin crawl. Every single one was dark. Not just curtained. Dark. Like the house itself was watching. Waiting. He got out of the car slowly. One hand instinctively reaching for the gun that wasn't there anymore. Force of habit. 40 years of entering unknown situations with his weapon drawn. The air smelled like wet earth and decay. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called out, the sound echoing through the trees. Nate approached the front door, gravel crunching under his shoes. The porch steps were solid stone worn smooth by decades of footsteps. The door itself was oak-heavy with an iron knocker shaped like a lion's head. He pulled out the keys from the envelope. 3 keys on a ring, one for the front door, the other 2 unmarked. The lock turned smoothly, well-oiled, despite the house's apparent abandonment. The door swung inward with a low creak. Darkness. Nate stood on the threshold, every instinct screaming at him to turn around, to get back in his car. to drive away and never look back. But Lorelei had died for whatever was inside this house, and he owed her the truth. He stepped inside. The interior smelled like old wood and dust and something else. Something faint but unmistakable to a man who'd worked homicide for 20 years. Fear. The kind that soaked into walls, that lingered in floorboards, that became part of a place's architecture. Nate's eyes adjusted to the dimness. He was standing in a grand foyer, marble floors, a sweeping staircase that curved up to the second floor, crown molding, high ceilings, the kind of craftsmanship that didn't exist anymore. But everything was covered in dust, thick layers of it, like no one had lived here in years, except Lorelei had been here 6 months ago. Nate walked through the foyer into what looked like a sitting room, sheet-covered furniture, a fireplace with a stone mantel, bookshelves lining one wall empty except for a few forgotten volumes. He moved methodically room by room. Kitchen with ancient appliances, dining room with a table that could seat 12, a library, a study, all of it frozen in time, all of it waiting. On the second floor he found bedrooms, 6 of them, most empty. But one at the end of the hall had clearly been used recently. Lorelei's room. Nate stood in the doorway, his throat constricting. She'd set up a workspace, a folding table with a laptop closed, stacks of papers, file folders, a corkboard mounted on the wall covered in photographs, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes connected by a red string like something out of a crime drama. He stepped closer. The center of the board had a photograph of a young girl, 8, maybe 9 years old. Dark hair, serious eyes. She wore a plain dress and stood in front of a building with other children, all of them lined up like a class photo. Beneath the photo, written in Lorelei's handwriting, Mom, age 8. Blackwood Sanitarium, 1965. Nate's blood went cold. Margaret. His Margaret. The woman he'd shared a bed with for 22 years. The woman who'd borne his child. The woman he'd watched die. She'd been in a sanitarium, and she'd never told him. He scanned the rest of the board. More photos. Newspaper clippings with headlines he could barely process. Blackwood Sanitarium closed after patient deaths. Investigation into allegations of abuse. No charges filed in controversial case. And then, in the corner, a small index card with a single sentence in Lorelei's writing. They didn't treat sick children. They silenced inconvenient ones. Nate's hands were shaking. He turned to the desk, opened the laptop. Dead battery. He'd need to charge it. But beside the computer was a leather journal. Brown worn, the edges frayed from use. He picked it up, opened to the first page. Lorelei's handwriting again. Day 1. I bought the house. I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't know what I'm looking for. But I can't stop thinking about the last thing Mom said to me before she died. I was sitting next to her hospital bed. She was so thin, so fragile. The morphine made her confused sometimes. She'd forget where she was, who I was. But that day she was lucid, clear. She grabbed my hand and she said, "Don't let them bury it with me." I asked her what she meant. She just kept saying it. over and over. Don't let them bury it. Don't let them bury it. I thought she was talking about her ashes, or her jewelry, some family heirloom. But now I think she meant the truth. Nate had to stop reading. His vision was blurring. He remembered that day. He'd been at the station finishing paperwork on a gang shooting in Roxbury. His phone had rung. Lorelei crying so hard he could barely understand her. "Dad, you need to come. Now. She's asking for you." He'd driven 90 miles an hour to the hospital, ran through the corridors, burst into Margaret's room expecting the worst. But she was sleeping, peaceful. Lorelei sat beside her, holding her hand. She was awake 10 minutes ago. Lorelei had said her voice hollow. She said something strange about burying things, about secrets. Nate had brushed it off. Morphine, confusion, the brain shutting down. He'd been wrong. He closed the journal, set it back on the desk. His chest felt tight. Breathing was difficult. A sound broke the silence. Faint, distant, coming from below. Nate froze, listening. There it was again. A rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood, or something knocking. He left Lorelei's room, walked to the landing, looked down into the dark foyer below. Nothing. The knocking continued. Steady. Intentional. Coming from the basement. Nate descended the stairs slowly, his hand trailing along the banister. Every instinct honed by 4 decades of police work was screaming warnings, unknown location, no backup, no weapon. But he kept moving. The door to the basement was in the kitchen behind what looked like a pantry. Nate pulled it open. Stone steps led down into darkness. The knocking was louder now, more insistent. He found a light switch, flipped it. A single bulb illuminated the stairwell, casting long shadows. Nate descended. The basement was larger than he'd expected. Not a cellar, but a series of rooms. The walls were stone, the same gray rock as the exterior. The floor was concrete, cracked with age. The knocking had stopped. Nate stood at the bottom of the stairs, letting his eyes adjust. The space smelled damp. Mildew and earth and something chemical. Antiseptic, maybe, like a hospital. To his left, a doorway led into darkness. To his right, another door, this one closed. He tried the handle. Locked. One of the unmarked keys from the ring fit perfectly. The door swung open, and Nate's breath caught in his throat. The room was set up like a recording studio, makeshift but functional. A folding table with professional audio equipment, microphones, a mixing board, headphones hanging from a hook on the wall, and in the center of the table a cassette player. Old. The kind they'd used in interrogation rooms back in the 80s before everything went digital. Next to it, a cardboard box filled with cassette tapes, each one labeled in neat handwriting that wasn't Lorelei's. Nate picked up the first tape. Patient MC Session 1, September 14th, 1965. MC, Margaret Caldwell. His wife's maiden name. Nate's hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped the tape. He loaded it into the player, fumbled with the buttons. Static. Then a click. Then a voice. Male. Calm. Clinical. "This is Dr. Henry Blackwood. September 14th, 1965. Initial evaluation of patient Margaret Caldwell, age 8 years, 3 months. Admitted by Father Sheriff Thomas Caldwell for treatment of delusional episodes and violent outbursts. A pause, then another voice, small, frightened, a child's voice. I'm not crazy, I'm not. I saw him, I saw the man. He was bleeding. Margaret, we've talked about this. Your father explained that you've been having bad dreams. It wasn't a dream he was in Daddy's study. He was real. He told me to tell them what happened. He said, "That's enough, Margaret. We're going to help you understand the difference between what's real and what's in your imagination. Do you want to get better? I'm not sick. That's what sick people always say, sweetheart. Now, I'm going to give you some medicine. It's going to make you feel calm, peaceful. And then we'll talk again tomorrow." No, please, I don't want. The sound of a struggle. A child screaming. Then, silence. Dr. Blackwood's voice returned, speaking as if nothing had happened. Patient is resistant to treatment. Recommend increased dosage and isolation protocol. Will continue evaluation tomorrow. Click. The tape ended. Nate stood frozen in the basement of Stone Cottage, staring at the cassette player. Margaret, 8 years old, locked away by her own father because she'd witnessed something. Because she'd told the truth and no one wanted to hear it. He looked at the box of tapes. 47 in total. Years of sessions. Years of a child being told she was crazy when she wasn't. Years of drugs and isolation, and God knew what else. And she'd never said a word. Not to him. Not in 22 years of marriage. Not even when she was dying. Nate sank into the folding chair, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight. How much of Margaret had been real? How much had been the woman he thought he knew versus the broken girl who'd survived this place? He thought about the nightmares. The way she'd wake up screaming, drenched in sweat. Her eyes wild with terror. She could never explain. The way she'd flinch sometimes when he touched her. Unexpectedly. The way she'd lock herself in the bathroom for hours. And he'd hear her crying through the door. But she'd never let him in. He'd thought it was anxiety, depression. She'd seen therapists, taken medication. But it was never enough. Because the real sickness wasn't in her mind. It was in what had been done to her. Nate reached for the second tape with trembling hands. Patient MC Session 2, September 21st, 1965. He pressed play. "Margaret, can you tell me about the man you saw?" He was tall. He had blood on his shirt, on his hands. "And where did you see this man?" "In Daddy's study. At night. I couldn't sleep. I heard voices downstairs. Daddy was talking to someone. He sounded angry. So I went to see. You were eavesdropping." "I wasn't trying to. I heard my name. Daddy was saying my name. So I looked through the crack in the door." "And what did you see?" "The man. He was standing in front of Daddy's desk. He was crying, saying he didn't mean to, that it was an accident, and Daddy was telling him to calm down, that they'd figure it out. Who was this man, Margaret? I don't know. I'd never seen him before. But you said he was bleeding. Yes, from his head, like someone had hit him. And then Daddy saw me. He got so angry. He told me to go back to bed, that I'd been dreaming. But I wasn't dreaming, Dr. Blackwood. I wasn't. A long pause. Margaret, your father is the sheriff. A good man, a respected man. Do you think he would lie to you? No, but do you think your father would let a bleeding man stand in his study and not call for help? Silence. Margaret, I think you're confused. I think you had a nightmare, and it felt very real, but it wasn't. And the more you insist it was real, the sicker you're going to become. Do you understand? Do you understand a child sob? Yes. Good girl. Now take this pill. It'll help you sleep. And tomorrow we'll talk about how to tell the difference between dreams and reality. Click. Nate stopped the tape. His jaw was clenched so tight his teeth ached. Margaret hadn't been delusional. She'd witnessed something her father didn't want exposed. And instead of protecting her, instead of believing her, Sheriff Thomas Caldwell had locked his 8-year-old daughter in a psychiatric facility and let them convince her she was insane. Nate knew what that did to a person. He'd seen it in victims, in witnesses who'd been gaslit by abusers until they questioned their own memories. But to do it to a child, your own child. He stood up, paced the small room. His mind was racing, shifting into detective mode. Analyzing, cataloging. September 1965. Margaret sees a bleeding man in her father's study. The man is crying, talking about an accident. Thomas Caldwell tells him they'll figure it out. Days later, Margaret is committed to Blackwood Sanitarium. What happened in between? Nate looked at the box of tapes again. 47 sessions spanning 7 years. 1965 to 1972. 7 years of Margaret's childhood erased. He needed to hear more. But not now. Not in this basement with the walls closing in and the weight of his wife's suffering pressing down on him like a physical force. He grabbed the box of tapes, carried it upstairs to the kitchen, set it on the counter. Then he walked back through the house to the front door, stepped outside into the fading afternoon light. The air was cold, clean. He filled his lungs, tried to steady himself. A truck was pulling into the driveway. Old Ford, faded blue paint rust eating through the wheel wells. It came to a stop next to Nate's sedan. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. Late 60s. Tall, broad-shouldered despite his age. Gray hair cut military short. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt, and moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had started betraying him, but whose mind refused to acknowledge it. He looked at Nate with eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. "You must be Nathaniel Brennan." His voice was gravel. A lifetime of cigarettes and hard living. Nate nodded slowly. "Who are you?" "Garrison Hartley. People call me Gary." He extended a hand. "I've been looking after this place for 20 years. Your daughter hired me to keep doing it when she bought the property." Nate shook his hand. Firm grip. Working man's calluses. "You knew Lorelei." "Met her 6 months ago when she first came up here. Smart girl." determined. Gary's expression darkened. "I'm real sorry about what happened to her. You think it was an accident?" The question hung in the air between them. Gary held Nate's gaze for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly. "No, sir, I don't." Nate felt something in his chest loosen. Validation. Finally, someone else who saw what he saw. "Why not?" Gary looked at the house, then back at Nate. "Because your daughter was asking questions. The kind of questions that make certain people nervous. And around here, people who ask too many questions about Blackwood tend to end up dead or disappeared." "Blackwood Sanitarium. You been doing your homework?" "I found the tapes." Gary's eyebrows rose. "She got them working hell. I told her those old cassettes probably wouldn't play anymore." "Who's on them?" "Patients. Kids who were locked up here from the 60s through the early 80s. Your wife was one of them." Nate's throat tightened. "You knew Margaret?" "Not personally, but I knew of her. Everyone in Millbrook knew about Thomas Caldwell's daughter. The girl who saw things that weren't there." Gary's voice dripped with bitterness. "Except they were there. She just wasn't supposed to say so." "What did she see?" "That's a long story, Mr. Brennan, and not one for standing outside in the cold. You want to come inside? I'll make coffee and tell you what I know." Nate glanced back at Stone Cottage. The windows still dark, still watching. "Yeah," he said. "I think I need to hear this." They sat in the kitchen as the sun set outside, turning the sky the color of a bruise. Gary made coffee in an old percolator he brought from his truck, and the smell filled the room with something almost normal, almost comforting. Nate wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into his fingers. Gary sat across from him at the small table, his own mug untouched. "I was sheriff of Millbrook for 32 years, Gary began. "Retired in 2010. Before that, I was a deputy. Started in 1976, right out of the service. Marines. 2 tours. Came back and didn't know what to do with myself. My old man said law enforcement was stable work, good pension. So I signed up." He took a sip of coffee, grimaced like it was whiskey. "Thomas Caldwell was sheriff when I started. Big man. Respected. Everyone in town looked up to him. He'd been sheriff for damn near 20 years by then. Knew everyone. Knew everything that happened in Millbrook and the surrounding counties, including what happened at Blackwood. Especially what happened at Blackwood." Gary's eyes went distant. "The sanitarium opened in 1960. Dr. Henry Blackwood ran it. He was from Boston, had credentials from some fancy medical school. Said he specialized in treating troubled youth. Parents from all over New England sent their kids here. How many? At its peak, maybe 40, 50 kids at a time. Ages 8 to 18. Some stayed a few months. Some stayed years." Gary's voice dropped. "Some never left." Nate felt ice in his veins. "How many died?" "Officially 3. 1983. That's what shut the place down. 3 patients died in one night from what they called medication overdoses. State came in, investigated, found all kinds of violations. Blackwood lost his license. The facility closed. And unofficially, Gary met his eyes. A lot more than 3, Mr. Brennan. But the records disappeared. Death certificates were altered. Families were paid off or threatened into silence. By the time anyone thought to ask questions, there was nothing left to find. Nate's detective instincts were screaming. Thomas Caldwell covered it up. Him and about a dozen others. Judges, business owners, even a few state representatives. Gary leaned back in his chair. See, Blackwood wasn't just treating sick kids. He was running a service. Parents who had children they couldn't control, couldn't handle, couldn't afford to deal with, they'd send them here. And Blackwood would make the problem go away. How? Drugs, isolation, electroshock therapy. Whatever it took to break them down until they were compliant. Until they forgot why they were angry, or scared, or speaking out in the first place. Nate thought about the tapes. Margaret's small voice, the fear in it. And if the kids weren't actually sick, Gary's expression hardened. Then they were made sick, or they were silenced permanently. The kitchen felt smaller, darker. Margaret saw something, Nate said quietly, in her father's study, a man with blood on him. She told Dr. Blackwood on the tapes. Gary nodded slowly. September 1965. I know the case. Your wife witnessed the aftermath of a murder. Farm couple outside town. Official reports said it was a murder-suicide. Husband killed his wife, then himself. But it wasn't. No, sir. It was a double homicide made to look like murder-suicide. The husband came to Thomas Caldwell for help. Showed up at his house, bleeding from a head wound, scared out of his mind. Said someone had attacked him and his wife. Said he'd run. And Thomas killed him. Thomas made the problem disappear. Cleaned up the scene. Made it look like the husband had snapped. And when his 8-year-old daughter said she'd seen the whole thing, Gary's voice was bitter. He locked her away and let Blackwood convince her she'd imagined it. Nate's hands were shaking again. He set down the coffee mug before he dropped it. Why are you telling me this? Because your daughter came here asking the same questions. And I told her the same things. And now she's dead. Gary leaned forward. I'm 67 years old, Mr. Brennan. I don't have much time left. And I've spent the last 40 years carrying the guilt of knowing what happened here and doing nothing about it. You were a sheriff. You could have investigated. I was a deputy, and then a sheriff in a small town where everyone knew everyone, and half the town council had skeletons in their closets tied to Blackwood. Gary's voice cracked. My own brother was a patient here. The words landed like a gunshot. Nate stared at him. What, Elliot? My little brother. 16 years old. My parents sent him here in '79 because he was gay. Said Blackwood could fix him. Make him normal. Gary's eyes were wet. He died in '83. One of the 3 official deaths. Medication overdose. Except I saw his body before they buried him. Saw the bruises. The marks on his wrists from restraints. That wasn't an overdose. That was murder. Did you report it? To who? Thomas Caldwell. The man who helped cover up every death at Blackwood for 20 years. Gary wiped his eyes roughly. I was 27 years old and scared, and I just lost my brother and I didn't know what to do. So I did nothing. And I've regretted it every day since. The kitchen was silent except for the ticking of an old clock on the wall. Nate's mind was racing, connecting pieces, building a timeline. Lorelei found evidence, he said. That's why she bought this house. She was building a case. She found more than evidence. She found proof. Videos, recordings, financial documents showing who paid Blackwood to keep the facility running even after the state shut it down. Who? The same people who had the most to lose if the truth came out. Families whose kids died here. Officials who covered it up. And one man in particular who was at the center of all of it. Thomas Caldwell. His brother, Judge Philip Caldwell. Nate felt the world tilt. Margaret's uncle. Gary nodded. Philip was a young lawyer back in the 60s. By the 70s, he was a judge. Used his position to make sure investigations went nowhere. Death certificates got approved. Blackwood stayed in business. He paused. And when Margaret started remembering things she wasn't supposed to remember, Philip made sure she stayed locked up. Jesus Christ. Your daughter tracked him down 3 months ago, contacted him, told him she had evidence, that she was going to expose everything. Nate's blood went cold. And then her brakes failed. Convenient timing. Where is he, Philip Caldwell? Is he still alive? Oh, he's alive. 78 years old. Retired judge, living in a nice house on the lake, respected member of the community. Plays golf twice a week. Donates to charity. Everyone thinks he's a pillar of society. Nate stood up his chair, scraping against the floor. I need to talk to him. Mr. Brennan, my daughter is dead. My wife spent her childhood being tortured in this place because of him. I need to look him in the eye and hear him say it. Gary stood slowly. And then what? You going to arrest him? You're not a cop anymore. You got no jurisdiction here. No authority. I don't need authority. I need the truth. The truth doesn't bring back the dead. No. Nate's voice was steel. But it makes sure they didn't die for nothing. Gary studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. All right, but not tonight. Tonight you need to go through what your daughter left behind. The tapes, the files, everything. Because if you're going to confront Philip Caldwell, you need to know exactly what you're walking into. He pulled a set of keys from his pocket, set them on the table. These opened the other rooms in the basement. Lorelei set up a whole archive down there. Everything she found. Everything she documented. Nate picked up the keys. One more thing, Gary said. Be careful. Philip Caldwell might be old, but he's still got friends. Still got power. Your daughter learned that the hard way. Is that a threat? It's a warning from someone who's seen what happens to people who cross him. Gary walked to the door, paused with his hand on the knob. Your wife was a fighter, Mr. Brennan. When she was a kid before they broke her, she fought like hell to make people believe her. I read her file. She never stopped telling the truth even when they punished her for it, even when they drugged her into silence. He looked back at Nate. Your daughter had the same fire. She came here knowing it might get her killed, and she did it anyway. What are you saying? I'm saying they deserve justice, and you're the only one left who can give it to them. The door closed behind him. The truck engine started. Headlights swept across the kitchen window as Gary backed out of the driveway. And then Nate was alone. He stood in the kitchen of Stone Cottage as darkness settled over the mountains outside. Stood in the house where his wife had been tortured. where his daughter had died trying to uncover the truth. And he made a decision. He wasn't leaving, not until he'd heard every tape, read every file, understood every moment of suffering that had been inflicted here. Not until he'd looked Philip Caldwell in the eye and made him answer for what he'd done. Not until justice was served, or revenge. At this point, Nate wasn't sure there was a difference anymore. He picked up the box of cassette tapes and carried them down to the basement. The recording studio was exactly as he'd left it. Equipment waiting. The cassette player ready. Nate sat in the folding chair, loaded the third tape. Patient MC Session 3, October 5th, 1965. He pressed play and listened to his wife's childhood being destroyed one session at a time. By 2 a.m, he'd made it through 12 tapes. 12 sessions spanning Margaret's first month at Blackwood. Each one worse than the last. Session 4. Margaret tried to escape. They caught her in the woods, brought her back, put her in isolation for a week. Session 6, she stopped eating, refused to take the medications. They force-fed her through a tube. Session 8, she asked when she could go home. Dr. Blackwood told her she'd stay until she was cured. She asked what she was being cured of. He didn't answer. Session 10, her voice had changed. Flatter, more distant. The drugs were taking hold. Session 12. She couldn't remember the man in her father's study. Couldn't remember why she was at Blackwood. When Dr. Blackwood asked her who she was, she hesitated before answering. Nate stopped the tape. He couldn't listen anymore. Not tonight. Not without losing his mind. He climbed the stairs back to the main floor, walked through the dark house to Lorelei's room. Her laptop was charging now. He opened it. Password protected. He tried her birthday. Nothing. Tried Margaret's birthday. Nothing. Then on instinct, he tried the date Margaret died. The screen unlocked. Files, folders, documents organized with the same methodical precision Nate had used on case files for 40 years. She'd learned from him. Even after 8 years of silence, even hating him, she'd absorbed the way he worked. The thought made his chest ache. He opened a folder labeled Timeline. A document appeared. Dates, names, events, all connected with arrows and notes. 1965. Thomas Caldwell covers up murder. Commits daughter to Blackwood. 1972. Margaret regains memory during therapy. Tells staff about murder. Philip Caldwell intervenes. Orders continued treatment. 1972. Late Margaret released from Blackwood, age 15. Memories fractured, trauma intact. 1983. Blackwood closed. 3 patients dead, including Elliot Hartley. 1995. Thomas Caldwell dies. Natural causes. 2018. Margaret diagnosed with cancer. 2019. Margaret dies. Final words to Lorelei. Don't let them bury it. 2022. 23. Lorelei begins investigation. 2024. February. Lorelei contacts Philip Caldwell. 2 weeks later, car accident. Nate stared at the screen. The pattern was clear. Anyone who got close to the truth ended up dead. Margaret had known. That's why she'd never told him. She'd been protecting him. And Lorelei had known too. That's why she'd written the letter. She'd understood the risk and taken it anyway. Nate clicked open another folder. Videos. Dozens of files. Each one labeled with dates and descriptions. He selected one at random. The screen filled with grainy footage. Black and white. A hallway. Institutional. Fluorescent lights. The timestamp read March 15th, 1981. A door opened. Two orderlies dragged a teenage boy down the hall. He was fighting screaming, but the audio was muted. They pulled him into a room. The camera angle shifted, showing the interior. A table, leather restraints, medical equipment. They strapped the boy down. He was still screaming. A man in a white coat entered. Dr. Blackwood. Younger than Nate had imagined. 40, maybe. Thin. Wire-rimmed glasses. He prepared a syringe. Injected something into the boy's arm. The boy's body went rigid. Then slack. Blackwood made notes on a clipboard. Checked the boy's vitals. Then left the room. The orderlies followed. The boy lay on the table alone, unconscious. The timestamp ticked forward. Minutes passed. The boy didn't move. Nate watched his stomach churning. 10 minutes. 15. At 23 minutes, the boy convulsed. Once. Twice. Then stopped. The timestamp continued. The body didn't move again. At 47 minutes, an orderly returned, checked for a pulse, shook his head, made a phone call on the wall-mounted phone. 5 minutes later, Dr. Blackwood returned, examined the body, made more notes. Then they unstrapped the corpse and wheeled it out on a gurney. The video ended. Nate sat frozen, staring at the blank screen. That boy was one of the official deaths, one of the 3 that shut down Blackwood. Except it wasn't an accident. It was murder. And someone had recorded it, kept the evidence, hidden it for 40 years. Nate checked the file properties. The video had been copied from a VHS tape 6 months ago. By Lorelei, which meant she'd found the original recordings somewhere in this house. He stood up, energized now despite the hour, despite the exhaustion. If the videos were here, there was more. More evidence. More proof. He grabbed a flashlight from Lorelei's desk and headed back to the basement. The second key on Gary's ring fit the door across from the recording studio. It swung open to reveal a larger room. Shelves lined the walls. Boxes stacked floor to ceiling. File cabinets. Plastic bins. Nate stepped inside, swept the flashlight across the space. This was it. The archive. Everything Blackwood had kept. Everything Lorelei had found. He opened the nearest box. Medical files. Dozens of them. Patient histories. Treatment records. Death certificates. He pulled one at random. Patient 423. Timothy Kowalski. Age 12. Admitted November 1970. Diagnosis conduct disorder. Nate scanned the file. The boy's father was a Korean War veteran with documented PTSD. The boy had called the police multiple times reporting domestic violence. Instead of arresting the father, they committed the son. Treatment notes showed escalating doses of sedatives, isolation, electroshock. Final entry: patient deceased. Cardiac arrest. November 1972. Age 14. Nate set the file aside, pulled another. Patient 438. Elliot Hartley. Age 16. Gary's brother. He opened it slowly. Admitted June 1979. Diagnosis: sexual deviancy. Parents' statement: our son has been engaging in sinful behavior. We believe treatment can correct this. Treatment plan: aversion therapy, medication, religious counseling. The notes detailed months of torture disguised as medicine, shocks administered while showing the boy images, drugs that made him sick, isolation when he refused to recant. And then, final entry: patient deceased. Medication overdose. March 14th, 1983. But someone had written in the margin in different ink: murder. Witnessed by patient 447. Patient 447. Nate's hands were shaking. He went to the file cabinet, pulled open drawers until he found the 400s. Patient 447. Margaret Caldwell. Age 23. The file was thick. Years of treatment notes. But the final entries were what made Nate's blood run cold. March 14th, 1983. Patient 447 found in hallway after lockdown. Claims to have witnessed staff member administering fatal dose to patient 438. Patient is delusional. Increasing medication. March 15th, 1983. Patient 447 attempted to contact authorities. Prevented. Patient placed in isolation. March 20th, 1983. Visit from Judge Philip Caldwell. Patient evaluation updated. Patient to remain indefinitely. Margaret had seen Elliot Hartley murdered. She tried to report it, and her own uncle had made sure she'd never be believed. Nate closed the file, his vision blurring with rage. How long had she carried this? How many years had she lived with the knowledge that she'd watched someone die and been powerless to stop it, to save him? No wonder she'd had nightmares. No wonder she'd woken up screaming. She'd been living with survivor's guilt and trauma, and the weight of knowing that everyone who was supposed to protect her had failed. Nate wiped his eyes roughly. He kept searching, kept pulling files, kept documenting the horror. 47 patients total in the 400 series. The final group before Blackwood closed. 12 of them died. Official records listed 3. 9 disappeared. Buried in unmarked graves, incinerated or dumped in the mountains. And the survivors carried scars that would never heal. At the bottom of one box, Nate found a ledger. Financial records. Payments made to Blackwood from 1965 to 1983. He flipped through pages of names and amounts. Thomas Caldwell. Regular payments from 1965 to 1972. Philip Caldwell. Starting in 1972. Continuing until 1983. Other names: Families Nate didn't recognize, but all of them paying for the same service, silence. And then tucked into the back of the ledger a VHS tape, labeled in Blackwood's handwriting, Insurance, 1983. Nate carried it upstairs, found an old VCR connected to a television in the sitting room, loaded the tape, and static. Then an image. Dr. Blackwood's office. The man himself sitting behind a desk looking directly at the camera. He was older now, late 50s, gray hair, tired eyes. "My name is Dr. Henry Blackwood. This recording is being made on March 20th, 1983. If you're watching this, it means I'm dead or arrested. Either way, the truth needs to be known." He leaned forward. "I ran Blackwood's Sanitarium for 23 years. In that time, I treated over 300 patients. Most were children. Many were not sick. They were inconvenient. Witnesses to crimes. Victims of abuse who spoke out. Kids who didn't fit their parents' expectations." His voice was steady, unemotional. "I was paid by law enforcement judges, business owners, and families to make problems disappear. To chemically lobotomize children until they forgot what they'd seen. Or to eliminate them entirely, if they couldn't be broken." He pulled out a folder. "This contains documentation of every payment, every patient, every death. I kept meticulous records because I knew someday this would come back to me. And when it did, I wanted leverage." The camera zoomed in on the folder as he opened it. "Thomas Caldwell, sheriff of Millbrook. Paid me to institutionalize his daughter after she witnessed him cover up a murder in his study. Paid me for 7 years to keep her silent." He turned a page. "Philip Caldwell, judge, Thomas's brother. Took over payments when Thomas's daughter started regaining her memory. Philip had his own reasons for keeping her locked up. In 1972, Margaret Caldwell remembered what she'd seen in her father's study. But she remembered something else, too. She remembered seeing Philip Caldwell there, standing over the body. It wasn't Thomas who killed that man. It was Philip." Nate's heart stopped. Philip Caldwell murdered a farmer and his wife in September 1965. Made it look like murder-suicide. When the farmer's 8-year-old daughter saw him at her father's house that night, covered in blood, he convinced Thomas to commit her, to make sure she'd never testify. Blackwood's expression didn't change. "I have video evidence of patient deaths, audio recordings of confessions, financial proof of conspiracy. I kept this tape hidden in the vault beneath the chapel, along with the original recordings. If this tape is being watched, it means someone found my insurance. Use it wisely." He reached forward. The screen went black. Nate sat in the dark sitting room, the only sound the hiss of static from the television. Philip Caldwell was a murderer. He'd killed 3 people in 1965, covered it up with his brother's help, locked away the only witness. And 40 years later, when that witness's daughter got too close to the truth, he'd killed again. Nate stood slowly. His hands weren't shaking anymore. His mind was clear, focused. The way it used to be when he was working a case and all the pieces finally clicked into place. He knew what he had to do. He went back to Lorelei's room, opened her laptop, found the folder with Philip Caldwell's address, 23 Lakeview Drive, 12 miles from Stone Cottage. Nate checked his watch. 4 in the morning. He could be there by 4:30. He grabbed his jacket, checked his pockets. Gary had returned his old service weapon when he'd arrived earlier. A Glock 19, fully loaded. Nate hadn't carried a gun in 2 years. Tonight he was carrying one again. He walked out to his car, started the engine. The road was dark, empty. No other headlights, no witnesses, just the way it should be. Because what he was about to do wasn't legal, wasn't sanctioned, wasn't something a retired cop should even consider. But he didn't care. His wife had died carrying the weight of what Philip Caldwell had done to her. His daughter had died trying to expose him, and Nate Brennan wasn't going to let him get away with it. Not tonight. Not ever. The lake house appeared in his headlights, large, modern. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the water. The house of a man who'd never faced consequences. Nate parked at the end of the driveway, turned off the engine, sat in the dark feeling the weight of the gun in his jacket. 40 years of upholding the law. 40 years of believing in justice. And here he was ready to throw it all away. For Margaret. For Lorelei. For every child who died screaming in that house and been buried without a name. Nate got out of the car, walked up the driveway, stood at the front door, and knocked. Inside, a light turned on. Footsteps approached. The door opened. An old man stood there. 78, but still tall. Still imposing. Gray hair. Sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He looked at Nate with the expression of someone who'd been expecting this moment for a very long time. "Nathaniel Brennan," Philip Caldwell said. His voice was calm, almost amused. "I wondered when you'd show up." Nate didn't move, didn't speak. Philip stepped aside, gesturing into the house. "Come in. I think it's time we had a conversation about your family." And despite every instinct screaming at him to turn around to call the authorities to do this the right way, Nate stepped across the threshold. The door closed behind him, and whatever was going to happen next, there was no going back from it. Philip Caldwell's house smelled like expensive whiskey and old leather, the kind of smell that came with money and power, and the belief that consequences were for other people. Nate followed him through a marble foyer into a study that overlooked the lake. The windows reflected their images like ghosts. An old man and an older man, separated by guilt and grief and 40 years of buried truth. Philip gestured to a leather chair. "Sit." Nate remained standing. His hands stayed near his jacket, near the gun. Philip noticed. A small smile touched his lips. "You're not going to shoot me, Mr. Brennan. You spent 40 years being a good cop. That doesn't just disappear because you're angry. You killed my daughter. I had her killed. There's a difference." Philip poured himself a drink from a crystal decanter. Didn't offer one to Nate. Lorelei was remarkably persistent, like her grandmother. Margaret never knew when to stop talking either. The casual way he said it, like he was discussing the weather. Nate's jaw clenched. Why? Why what? Why did I kill them? Why did I cover it up? Why am I telling you this now? Philip took a sip of whiskey. You'll have to be more specific. The farmer and his wife, 1965. Why did you kill them? Philip settled into the chair behind his desk, studied Nate with the same calculating expression he probably used from the bench for 40 years. Helen Morrison, the farmer's wife. We were having an affair. Had been for 6 months. Her husband found out. Threatened to tell my wife, my colleagues, everyone. Back then, that kind of scandal could destroy a career. So I went to their farm to reason with him. He swirled the whiskey in his glass. He attacked me. We fought. I grabbed a fireplace poker. Hit him once. That's all it took. He went down and didn't get up. Helen started screaming. Said she was going to call the police. I couldn't let that happen. The clinical detachment in his voice was worse than emotion would have been. So you killed her too, with the same poker. Made it look like he'd done it. Then killed himself. Crime of passion. Tragic but clean. Philip's eyes were flat, empty. It would have worked perfectly if Thomas's daughter hadn't seen me leaving his house later that night. Margaret was 8 years old. She was a witness. Age is irrelevant. Nate's hand moved closer to his gun. Philip noticed. Didn't react. My brother panicked. Wanted to handle it quietly. So we made an arrangement. Margaret would go to Blackwood. Dr. Blackwood would convince her she'd imagined everything. A few months of treatment, and she'd be home, memory adjusted, problem solved. Except it wasn't a few months. It was 7 years. She was stubborn. Philip finished his whiskey. Poured another. Every time Blackwood thought she was ready to release, she'd have a breakthrough. Remember details. Start asking questions. So we'd extend her treatment. More medication. More therapy. More convincing her that her own mind was lying to her. Nate thought about the tapes. Margaret's voice getting smaller, more uncertain, until she couldn't remember her own name. You destroyed her. I preserved my life. There's a difference. Philip leaned back. Margaret was collateral damage, unfortunate but necessary. She eventually integrated back into society, married you, had a daughter. From a certain perspective, she had a good life. She had nightmares every night, woke up screaming, couldn't trust her own memories. Post-traumatic stress, manageable with medication. Philip said it like he was discussing a broken appliance. The human mind is remarkably resilient. Margaret survived. That's more than I can say for the others. Elliot Hartley. The name hung in the air. Philip's expression didn't change. Garrison's little brother. Yes, he was unfortunate timing. He witnessed you paying off Blackwood, heard you discussing Margaret's continued treatment. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. March 1983. I was at Blackwood finalizing arrangements. The state was investigating. We needed to make sure certain evidence disappeared before they arrived. Elliot had been wandering the halls, heard things he shouldn't have. So you had him killed. The staff administered a lethal dose and documented it as accidental overdose. 1 of 3 that night. Perfect cover. Philip's voice remained steady. Practiced. Margaret witnessed it, tried to report it, but by then everyone knew she was unreliable, delusional, No one believed her. Nate's vision was blurring red. She watched you murder someone and you made sure no one would ever believe her. I ensured continuity. Margaret's testimony would have unraveled everything. The farm murders, Blackwood's operation, 20 years of careful arrangement. Philip walked to the window. She lived another 36 years after that night. Married. Had a child. Died of natural causes. All things considered, she got off easy. Easy? The word came out like gravel. Philip turned, met Nate's eyes. Mr. Brennan, do you know how many people benefited from Blackwood services? How many careers were protected? How many family secrets stayed buried? Hundreds of people got to live normal lives because inconvenient truths were managed appropriately. Managed. You mean erased? Semantics. Philip waved dismissively. The point is, the system worked. For decades it worked. Until your daughter decided to play investigative journalist. Nate's hand closed around the gun grip. Lorelei found Blackwood's insurance tape. I assumed as much. She contacted me 3 months ago. Said she had evidence. Video recordings. Financial documents. Proof of conspiracy. Philip's smile was cold. She wanted to meet. Discuss terms. She actually thought she could negotiate with me. So you had her killed. I had her brake line cut. Clean, efficient. Tragic accident on a mountain road. No investigation necessary. He tilted his head. You should be proud. She was smart enough to hide copies of everything before she contacted me. Took me weeks to find her storage unit and archive in Portland. But I did. Destroyed it all. Except what she left in Stone Cottage. Philip's smile faded slightly. You have copies too. That's why you're here. You think you can use them against me. Nate pulled out his phone. Held it up. The screen showed the insurance tape. Blackwood's confession. Philip's face clearly visible in the still frame. I have everything. Audio. Video. Financial records. Patient files. All of it digitized. All of it backed up in multiple locations. Cloud storage. Physical drives. Sent to attorneys with instructions to release if anything happens to me. Philip's expression hardened. You're bluffing. Am I? Nate's voice was ice. Lorelei was smarter than you gave her credit for. She knew contacting you was dangerous. So she prepared. Set up dead man switches. Fail safes. Everything uploads automatically if she doesn't check in. It was a lie, but a necessary one. Nate would have to upload everything himself. Make the bluff real. The old judge's jaw tightened. What do you want? Money I have accounts. Offshore. Untraceable. I want you to confess. To the police, don't be naive. I have friends in every department from here to Boston. Any confession would disappear before it reached a prosecutor. Not the police. Nate held up the phone again. To me. On camera. Everything. The murders. Blackwood. Margaret. Elliot. Lorelei. All of it. Philip stared at him, then laughed. A dry, humorless sound. You think a recording will matter? I'm 78 years old, retired. Even if you released it, I'd claim dementia. Coercion. My lawyers would bury it in motions for years. I'd die of old age before seeing a courtroom. Maybe. But everyone would know. Your colleagues, your family, every person in Millbrook who thinks you're a pillar of the community. They'd know what you really are. A survivor. Someone who did what was necessary. A monster. Philip's eyes went cold. We're all monsters, Mr. Brennan. The only difference is some of us are honest about it. He moved fast for a 78-year-old man. The desk drawer. Reaching for something. Nate's training kicked in. Weapon drawn. Aimed. Don't. Philip froze. Hand halfway to the drawer. They stared at each other across the desk. You won't shoot me, Philip said quietly. You're not that kind of cop. You follow rules, procedure, the law. The law failed my family. The law is what I say it is. I was a judge for 40 years. I wrote the rules. Nate's finger tightened on the trigger. One shot. That's all it would take. Justice for Margaret. For Lorelei. For Elliot Hartley and every child who died screaming in that house. But Philip was right. 40 years of being a good cop doesn't disappear. Nate lowered the gun, slightly. Hands on the desk, now. Philip complied, slowly. The calculating look never leaving his eyes. Nate circled around, checked the drawer. A revolver. Loaded. He removed it. Tucked it in his belt. Sit down. Philip sat. Nate pulled out his phone again. Started recording. State your name. This is coercion. Anything I say is inadmissible. I'm not a cop anymore. I don't care about admissible. State your name. A long pause. Then, almost amused, Philip James Caldwell. Tell me about September 1965. And Philip did. Maybe it was arrogance. Maybe he genuinely believed nothing would come of it. Maybe after 59 years of getting away with murder, he wanted someone to know how smart he'd been. Whatever the reason he talked. For 40 minutes, Nate recorded everything. The affair. The murders. Margaret's institutionalization. The payments to Blackwood. Elliot Hartley's death. The cover-up. The state investigation they derailed. And finally, Lorelei. She called me February 14th, Valentine's Day. Poetic, really. Said she had proof. Video of me at Blackwood in '83. Audio of me discussing payments. She wanted money. $2 million to keep quiet. Philip's voice was matter of fact. I agreed to meet. Set the location. A restaurant in Burlington. Public. Safe. Or so she thought. He smiled. I had a mechanic I've used before. Reliable, discreet. He followed her from the restaurant. Waited until she was on Route 7 that stretched through the mountains. Cut her brake line while she was inside a gas station. She made it another 12 miles before the brakes failed on a curve. Nate's hand shook. The phone nearly slipped from his grip. State police called it an accident. Didn't even run a full investigation. Just another tragedy on a dangerous road. Philip leaned back. The mechanic removed the evidence, disappeared the tools. By the time anyone thought to look, there was nothing to find. You murdered her in cold blood. I eliminated a threat, just like I eliminated her grandmother's credibility, just like I eliminated Elliot Hartley, just like I'll eliminate anyone else who tries to destroy what I've built. He stood up. Nate raised the gun again. Sit down. No. Philip walked to the window, looked out at the lake. You have your confession. Use it however you want. But understand something, Mr. Brennan. I have no regrets. I did what I had to do to survive, to protect my reputation, my legacy. Your legacy is blood. My legacy is a 40-year career as a respected judge, a lifetime of service to this community. Whatever else happened, that's what people will remember. Not when this recording goes public. Philip turned. His smile was sad, almost pitying. You really think you can win this? You're one man, retired, no badge, no authority. I have lawyers, money, connections in every level of government. He shook his head. Even with that recording, you'll lose. I'll be dead before you get a conviction. And everything I've built will stay standing. I don't need a conviction. Nate's voice was quiet, certain. I just need the truth to come out. Truth is whatever people believe. And people believe what they're told by authority. Philip gestured to himself. I'm the authority. You're just an angry old man looking for someone to blame for his family's tragedies. The dismissal was worse than anything else he'd said. Nate pocketed the phone, kept the gun trained. You're coming with me. Where the police, I told you I have friends. Not the police. Stone Cottage. Philip's expression flickered. The first real emotion Nate had seen. Fear. I'm not going back there. You don't have a choice. I haven't set foot in that house since 1983. I'm not. Move. Nate gestured with the gun. Philip didn't budge. You can't make me. You're right. I can't. Nate pulled out his phone again. But I can call Garrison Hartley. Tell him you confessed to murdering his brother. See how long it takes him to drive here. Philip's face went pale. Gary wouldn't. Gary's been waiting 40 years for justice. You think he cares about legal process? Nate's smile was cold. You killed his little brother. Let him die alone. Made sure no one was ever held accountable. What do you think he'll do if I give him your address? The calculation in Philip's eyes. Weighing options. Measuring risks. Finally, he nodded. All right, I'll go. But this doesn't change anything. We'll see. Nate kept the gun trained as Philip grabbed a coat, led him out to the car, put him in the passenger seat. No cuffs, no restraints, just the implicit threat of violence if he tried to run. They drove through the pre-dawn darkness in silence. Philip stared out the window. Nate watched the road. The trees closed in as they approached Stone Cottage. The headlights cut through the mist rising from the ground. The house appeared, dark, waiting. Philip's breathing changed, faster, shallower. Nate parked in the circular driveway, killed the engine. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Philip spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I used to have nightmares about this place. For years after we closed it. I'd dream I was walking through the halls, hearing the children screaming, watching them die, and I couldn't leave. The doors were locked, the windows sealed. I was trapped inside with all the ghosts. He turned to look at Nate. Then the dream stopped. I convinced myself it was over, that the past was buried, that no one would ever know. His laugh was bitter. But you can't bury the past, can you? It just waits, patient, until someone comes digging. Lorelei came digging. Margaret never stopped digging. Even when she couldn't remember why. Even when the medication made her forget her own name, some part of her remembered. Knew something was wrong. That's why she had nightmares. That's why she couldn't sleep. Her subconscious never stopped fighting. Philip looked back at the house. She was stronger than I gave her credit for. Stronger than anyone. She survived 7 years in that place. Survived me. Survived the knowing. Most people would have broken completely. But not Margaret. She built a life anyway. Found love. Had a daughter. Made something beautiful out of all that horror. His voice cracked. And I took it all away from her. Nate said nothing. Philip wiped his eyes. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know there's none to give. But I want you to understand. I'm not a monster. I'm just a man who made a choice. And then spent 59 years living with it. You made a lot of choices. Every single one of them hurt someone. Yes. Philip nodded slowly. Yes, they did. He opened the car door, stepped out into the mist. Nate followed, gun ready. They walked to the front door. Nate unlocked it. The hinges creaked. The darkness inside seemed deeper than before, heavier. Philip stopped at the threshold. I can't. You will. Nate pushed him forward. Philip stumbled inside, caught himself against the wall. His breathing was ragged now, panicked. The children, can you hear them? They're still here, still screaming. There's no one here. You don't understand. They never left. Every child who died in this place, every patient who was tortured, they're all still here, waiting. Philip's eyes were wild now, the composed judge facade cracking. Nate flipped a light switch. Nothing happened. The power was off. He pulled out a flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness. Downstairs. No, please, not the basement. That's where the evidence is. That's where the truth lives. Nate guided him through the house, through the kitchen, to the basement door. Philip was shaking now. Full body tremors. I won't go down there. You can't make me. You don't have to. A new voice from behind them. Nate spun flashlight and gun raised. Garrison Hartley stood in the kitchen doorway. He held a shotgun, not pointed at anyone, just held, ready. Gary. Nate. The old sheriff's eyes moved to Philip. Something dark and terrible crossed his face. Been a long time, Judge Caldwell. Philip backed against the wall. Garrison, I never meant for Elliot to... Don't. Gary's voice was steel. Don't you dare say his name. He was in the wrong place. It wasn't personal. He was my brother. He was 16 years old. And you had him murdered because he overheard you paying off a doctor. Gary stepped closer. I've spent 41 years wondering what his last moments were like. If he was scared. If he called for me. If he knew what was happening. He raised the shotgun, still not pointed, but the intent was clear. Then I read the files Lorelei found. Saw the autopsy photos she'd pulled from sealed records. You want to know what I learned, Judge? Philip said, nothing. Elliot didn't die from the overdose. Not right away. It took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of convulsions. Of his heart failing. Of him choking on his own vomit while he was strapped to a bed and no one helped him. Gary's voice broke. He died alone. In the dark. In pain. Because of you. I'm sorry. Sorry? Gary laughed. No humor in it. You're sorry. He chambered around. Nate stepped between them. Gary, don't. Move aside, Nate. I can't do that. He killed your daughter, your wife, my brother. How many more bodies before someone stops him? This isn't how we stop him. No. Gary's eyes were wet. Then how the law. He was a judge. He is the law. Justice doesn't exist for men like him. Maybe not legal justice, but there are other kinds. Nate pulled out his phone, held it up so Gary could see the screen. I have his confession. Everything. All of it recorded. And I'm gonna make sure it gets to the right people. The media. The FBI. Everyone. Gary's eyes narrowed. And you think that'll be enough? I think it'll do what needs to be done. Expose him. Destroy his legacy. Make sure everyone knows what he is. Nate looked at Philip. You said your legacy was 40 years as a judge. That's what people would remember. But now your legacy will be Blackwood. It'll be the children you helped torture, the witnesses you silenced, the murders you committed. He stepped closer. You'll live long enough to see everything you built destroyed. Your reputation, your standing, your name. By the time you die, no one will remember Judge Philip Caldwell. They'll only remember the monster. Philip slid down the wall, sat on the kitchen floor, face in his hands. That's not justice, Gary said quietly. That's just revenge. Maybe. But it's what we have. The three men stood in the kitchen of Stone Cottage as dawn broke outside. Gray light filtering through dirty windows. Finally, Gary spoke. There's someone else you should meet. He pulled out his phone, made a call. Father Dom, it's Gary. Yeah, Stone Cottage. Bring the others. 20 minutes later, headlights appeared in the driveway. Nate watched from the window as people emerged from cars. Old people, in their 60s and 70s, moving slowly, carefully. Gary met them at the door. These are the survivors, he said to Nate. The ones who lived through Blackwood and made it out. He gestured to an elderly man with kind eyes and a priest's collar. Father Dominic Sullivan. He was the chaplain here. 1975 to 83. Father Dominic nodded at Nate. His gaze moved to Philip. Something like pity crossed his face. "I prayed for you," he said quietly. "For years I prayed you'd find peace, find redemption." Philip didn't respond. Gary continued the introductions. "This is Marcus Reeves, patient 451. A black man in his late 60s, tall, dignified." He looked at Philip with hard eyes. "I was 14 when you had me committed. My crime, I saw 2 police officers take bribes from drug dealers. Reported it. Next thing I know, I'm diagnosed with paranoid delusions." He stepped closer to Philip. "I spent 3 years here. 3 years of drugs and isolation and being told my own mind was lying to me. When I got out, I couldn't hold a job, couldn't maintain relationships, couldn't trust anyone." His voice was quiet, controlled. "I lost my entire life because you needed to protect corrupt cops." A woman spoke next, small, fragile looking, but her voice was iron. "Sarah Kowalski. My brother Timothy was patient 423. He died here, age 14. Cardiac arrest from forced medication." She held up a photograph. A young boy, smiling, full of life. "This was Tim before Blackwood. Before your people convinced our father that Tim's behavior problems were mental illness instead of a response to abuse." She looked at the photo, then at Philip. "I'm 73 years old. I've spent 53 years missing my brother, wondering what he'd be like now. If he'd have kids, grandkids, what kind of man he'd have become." Her hands shook. "You took all of that away. From him. From me. From our entire family." More survivors spoke, each one adding their piece to the mosaic of horror that was Blackwood Sanitarium. Stories of childhood stolen, minds broken, lives destroyed. And through it all, Philip sat on the floor, silent, shrinking. Finally, Father Dominic knelt beside him. "I failed all of them," the old priest said. "I was supposed to provide spiritual comfort. Instead, I stood by while children were tortured. I told myself I was powerless, that speaking out would only get me removed, and then there'd be no one to pray with them at all." His voice cracked. "But the truth is, I was a coward. I chose my comfort over their safety, and I've spent 40 years trying to atone for that." He looked at Philip. "You still have time. Not much, but enough to do one right thing, one honest thing before you die. What would you have me do? Tell them." Father Dominic gestured to the survivors. "Tell them what you took from them, why you did it. Look them in the eyes and let them see your face when you admit what you are." Philip's eyes moved across the assembled faces. People whose lives he'd shattered, whose families he'd destroyed. For a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly, "I was 28 when I killed Helen Morrison and her husband. 28 and ambitious and terrified that a scandal would ruin my career." His voice was hoarse. "I made a choice. Them or me. And I chose me. Every time after that I chose me. My reputation, my future, my comfort. And I told myself it was necessary. That I was protecting important things. That the ends justified the means. He looked at Marcus. I'm sorry I destroyed your life to protect corrupt police. To Sarah, I'm sorry your brother died to keep my brother's crimes hidden. To each survivor in turn, I'm sorry I was more afraid of losing my status than I was of hurting children. The words sounded hollow, inadequate, because they were. No apology could undo 59 years of damage. No confession could bring back the dead. But it was something. Father Dominic stood, offered Philip a hand. After a moment, Philip took it, let himself be pulled to his feet. What happens now? He asked. Nate checked his phone. I'm going to upload everything to the FBI, the media. Make sure the world knows what happened here. You'll be arrested, tried. You'll spend whatever time you have left in prison. I'll die before trial. I have stage 4 cancer. 6 months at most. The room went silent. Of course he did. Of course the universe would give him an easy out. Then you'll die in a cell, Nate said flatly. But not before everyone knows what you did. Philip nodded slowly. I suppose that's fair. Fair would be you suffering the way your victims suffered. Fair would be 70 years in the dark being told your memories are lies. Fair doesn't exist for men like you. Gary stepped forward. I'm taking you into custody. Citizen's arrest. You're going to sit in my truck while we document everything in this house. Every file, every tape, every piece of evidence. And then we're driving to the FBI field office in Burlington, and you're going to confess. Again. On record. Official. I already confessed to Nate. Now you'll do it legally. With witnesses. With documentation. So there's no way for your lawyer friends to make it disappear. Philip looked at the faces surrounding him. Saw no mercy. No forgiveness. Only the weight of justice delayed but not denied. All right, he said quietly. I'll do it. The next 12 hours were a blur. The survivors helped document everything. Father Dominic read patient files aloud, his voice breaking at the worst entries. Marcus cataloged the financial records, building an airtight case of conspiracy. Sarah organized the audio tapes chronologically, creating a timeline of institutional abuse. Nate went through Lorelei's research, her notes, her analysis. She'd been meticulous. Every claim backed by evidence. Every accusation supported by documentation. She built a case that would have made any prosecutor weep with joy. And she died before seeing it through. Nate found her final journal entry, written the day before her death. Dad, if you're reading this, I succeeded. I found the truth. I documented everything. And I'm about to finish it. I'm meeting Philip Caldwell tomorrow. He doesn't know I've already prepared everything. Doesn't know that even if he kills me, the truth will come out. You'll make sure of it. I'm not afraid. Well, I am. But I'm doing it anyway. Mom deserved justice. Elliot Hartley deserved justice. All the children who died here deserve justice. And you deserve to know that Mom's nightmares weren't her fault. That the woman you loved was a survivor. That she was strong enough to build a life despite everything they did to her. I love you, Dad. I'm sorry it took me so long to say it. Finish this. Please. Lore. Nate closed the journal, wiped his eyes. Gary appeared beside him. You okay? No, but I will be. Once this is done. The FBI is expecting us in 2 hours. I called ahead. Told them we have a confession in a 59-year-old murder case. They're sending their best people. Nate nodded. Looked around the basement of Stone Cottage. So much pain contained in these walls. So many lives destroyed. But also evidence of resistance, of survival, of people who refused to let the truth die with them. Margaret had carried it in her nightmares. Lorelei had died exposing it. And now, finally, it would see daylight. Let's go, Nate said. Let's finish this. They loaded Philip into Gary's truck. The old judge sat in the back seat, hands folded in his lap. Resigned. Defeated. The survivors followed in their own vehicles. A convoy of witnesses making sure justice wouldn't be derailed again. As they pulled out of the driveway, Nate looked back at Stone Cottage one last time. The house stood silent, waiting. But it wasn't waiting for him anymore. It was waiting for what came next. For the truth to reshape it from a place of horror into a place of remembrance. For the ghosts to finally rest. For justice, however delayed, to finally arrive. The FBI field office in Burlington was a modern building, all glass and steel, the opposite of Stone Cottage's Gothic architecture. Special Agent Rebecca Torres met them in the lobby. 50s, sharp eyes, the look of someone who'd heard every lie and seen every con. Sheriff Hartley. Mr. Brennan. She nodded to them. Then her gaze moved to Philip. Judge Caldwell. I've been reading about you for the last 2 hours. You've had quite a career. I'm ready to confess. I'm sure you are. But we're going to do this properly. Lawyers present. Miranda rights. Everything documented. She led them to an interrogation room. Philip sat across from her. Nate and Gary watched through one-way glass. For 4 hours, Philip talked. He detailed every murder, every cover-up, every payment, every child whose life he'd destroyed. Agent Torres listened, asked questions, verified facts. When he finished, she sat back. Judge Caldwell, in my 26 years with the FBI, I've never heard a confession this comprehensive, this detailed. Why are you telling us this now? Philip looked tired, older than his 78 years. Because I'm dying. And I'd rather die knowing the truth came out than die with it buried inside me. Noble. But I think there's more to it than that. He smiled faintly. You're right. I'm confessing because the evidence exists. And I'd rather control how the story is told. There's no controlling this story. Not anymore. No. I suppose there isn't. Agent Torres stood. Philip Caldwell, you're under arrest for the murders of Helen Morrison, Robert Morrison, and Lorelei Brennan. Additional charges will follow as we process the evidence. She read him his rights, cuffed him, led him away. Nate watched through the glass as the old judge shuffled down the hallway, shoulders slumped, head down. 59 years of getting away with murder, ending in handcuffs. It should have felt better than it did. Gary stood beside him. It's not enough. No, but it's something. Elliot's been dead 41 years. 4 months and 2 days to be exact. I've counted every single one. And all I get is watching the man who killed him go to prison for 6 months before cancer finishes the job. Sometimes that's all justice is. Small victories, delayed consequences, truth that comes too late to save anyone but maybe prevents the next atrocity. Gary was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Your daughter was brave, braver than any of us." Yeah, she was. She didn't have to do this. Could have lived her whole life never knowing what happened to her grandmother, never digging into the past. She'd still be alive. But the truth would still be buried. Is truth worth dying for? Nate thought about Margaret, thought about Lorelei. Ask me again in a few months, when Philip's dead and buried and the story's moved on and Blackwood is just another true crime podcast. When the survivors are still carrying their trauma and the dead are still dead and nothing fundamental has changed. You think nothing will change? I think truth is necessary but not sufficient. Justice delayed is still injustice. And all we've done here is put a dying old man in prison for 6 months. Then why did we do it? Nate looked at Gary. Because it was the right thing to do, even if it's not enough, even if it doesn't fix anything. We did it because Margaret deserved someone to believe her. Lorelei deserved to have her work completed. And every child who died in that house deserved to have their story told. He turned away from the glass. Now, let's go home. I have 47 tapes left to listen to, and I owe it to my wife to hear every single one. The news broke 3 days later. Nate watched it on the television in his Boston apartment. Every major network running the same story. Retired judge arrested for decades-old murders. Conspiracy involving psychiatric facility. Cover-up spanning 50 years. Philip Caldwell's face filled the screen. The mugshot. Old. Tired. Nothing like the powerful man he'd pretended to be. Then footage of Stone Cottage. Reporters standing outside the iron gates explaining what had happened there. What had been done to children in the name of treatment. Nate's phone rang constantly. Other networks wanting interviews, magazines, podcasts. Everyone wanted the story of the detective who'd brought down a corrupt judge. He ignored them all. Because this wasn't his story. It was Margaret's. And Lorelei's. And every child who'd suffered in that place. His job now wasn't to talk about it. It was to finish what Lorelei had started. But first, he had to make her bluff real. Nate spent the next week uploading everything. Every file. Every video. Every tape. Every document. Cloud storage. Multiple servers. Encrypted drives sent to attorneys with instructions. The dead man switch Lorelei had never set up Nate built himself. If anything happened to him now, the truth would flood out automatically. Philip Caldwell's confession would be unstoppable. When it was done, Nate drove back to Vermont. Stone Cottage waited exactly as he'd left it. The basement archive, the tapes, the files. Gary met him there. "Thought you might need company," the old sheriff said. They sat in the basement together. Nate played the tapes. Gary read the files. Tape 15. Margaret, age 10. Her voice had changed. Flatter. the medication stripping away emotion. Dr. Blackwood says I'm getting better. I don't have the bad dreams anymore. I don't remember the things that made me sick. That's good, Margaret. What do you remember? I remember I live here, that you're helping me, that my father visits sometimes and says he's proud of my progress. Do you remember why you came here? A pause, long, uncertain. I was confused, seeing things that weren't real. But you've helped me understand. What did you see, Margaret? I don't remember anymore. And that's good. Dr. Blackwood says forgetting is part of healing. Nate stopped the tape. She was 10 years old, he said quietly. They'd already convinced her that her own memories were lies. Gary looked up from a file. This one's about a girl named Rachel. Patient 439, age 13. Committed because she reported her uncle for sexual abuse. He read aloud. Father states patient is prone to dramatic fabrications seeking attention. Recommend isolation and medication to address delusional behavior. His voice was hollow. The uncle was never investigated. Rachel spent 4 years here. When she got out, she recanted everything, said she'd made it up, apologized to her family. Did she make it up? No. I found the follow-up report. She committed suicide at 19. Left a note saying she couldn't live with what they'd done to her, with knowing her family chose her abuser over her. Nate closed his eyes. How many stories like this? How many children sacrificed to protect adults who should have protected them? They worked through the day, cataloging, documenting, bearing witness. As the sun set, Father Dominic arrived. He brought coffee and sandwiches no one wanted to eat. The archdiocese called, he said. They want me to make a statement, condemn what happened here, distance the church from it. Will you? I'll make a statement, but not the one they want. Father Dominic's jaw was set. I'm going to tell the truth, that I was here, that I knew what was happening, that I was complicit through my silence. They'll excommunicate you. Good. I don't deserve to wear this collar. Haven't for 40 years. He sat down heavily. I've been thinking about all the children I prayed with, all the times I offered empty comfort instead of real help, all the moments I chose institutional loyalty over human decency. Gary looked up. Dom, you were young. The system was evil, and I was part of it. Father Dominic's voice was firm. No amount of late repentance changes that. The 3 old men sat in silence, each carrying their own guilt, their own regrets. Finally, Nate spoke. My wife used to have nightmares every night for 22 years. She'd wake up screaming, wouldn't tell me what she saw. I'd hold her and she'd cry, and eventually she'd fall back asleep. He stared at the wall. I thought I was helping, thought my presence was enough. But I never asked the right questions, never pushed past her refusal to talk about it. I just accepted that she had trauma and loved her anyway. That is helping, Father Dominic said. No. Helping would have been making her feel safe enough to tell me the truth. Instead, she died carrying it, died thinking I could never understand, that I was too committed to the system that destroyed her. Nate's hands clenched. Lorelei was right to hate me. I chose my badge over my family. Every time. And by the time I realized it, it was too late to fix. You're fixing it now. Now they're both dead. What good is fixing it now? The question hung in the air. No one had an answer. They worked through the night, reading, listening, documenting. By dawn, they'd gone through all 47 of Margaret's tapes. The final one was dated April 1972. Margaret was 15. She'd been at Blackwood for 7 years. Dr. Blackwood's voice. Margaret, you've made remarkable progress. We're considering releasing you to outpatient care. Really? Her voice, older, cautious. I can go home. With conditions. You'll continue medication, weekly therapy sessions, and you'll need to demonstrate continued stability. I will. I promise. I just want to go home. Tell me, Margaret, do you remember why you came here? A long pause. I had problems, delusional thinking, confusion about reality. And now I understand that my mind was sick, that the things I thought I saw weren't real, that you helped me get better. Good. Very good. There's just one more thing we need to discuss. The sound of papers shuffling. Last week you told Nurse Patterson that you remembered something. About the night you came here. About seeing someone in your father's study. Margaret's breathing changed. Faster. I was confused. The memory wasn't real. Are you sure? Because it's important that we address any lingering delusions before release. I'm sure. It was just a bad dream. Like you said, I confuse dreams with reality. Tell me about the dream. I'd rather not. It upsets me. Margaret, we can't release you if you're still having disturbing thoughts. Tell me about the dream so we can process it together. A long silence. Then, quietly, I dreamed I saw a man in my father's study. He was bleeding, crying, and there was another man there. Tall, younger than my father. They were arguing. Who was the younger man? I don't know. It was just a dream. Margaret, it's very important that you tell me the truth. Who was the younger man? Her voice was barely a whisper. It looked like Uncle Philip. But it couldn't have been. Because it was just a dream. It wasn't real. The tape went silent except for breathing. Then Dr. Blackwood's voice, cold and clinical. Thank you for being honest, Margaret. I'm going to increase your medication dosage, and we'll postpone the release discussion. You're clearly not ready. No, please, I'm better. I was just... That's enough. Nurse Patterson will take you back to your room. Sounds of struggle. Margaret crying. Please, I'll say whatever you want. I'll forget again. I promise. Just, please let me go home. You'll go home when I say you're ready. Not before. The door closing. Lock engaging. Then Dr. Blackwood's voice again speaking to someone else in the room. She remembers. More than I thought. We'll need to continue treatment indefinitely. Another voice. Male. Familiar. Philip Caldwell. How long? As long as necessary. She can't be released while she's having these recollections. It's too dangerous. Make sure she forgets. Permanently. I don't care what it takes. That kind of intervention has risks. She could have permanent cognitive damage. Better that than her testifying. Silence. Then Blackwood again. I'll need additional compensation. This level of treatment is expensive. You'll have it. Just make sure the problem is handled. Footsteps. Door opening and closing. The tape ended. Nate sat staring at the cassette player. Margaret had remembered. At 15, she'd remembered everything. And instead of releasing her, they drugged her into permanent confusion. That's why her memories were fractured. Why she'd wake up screaming but couldn't explain what she'd seen. They'd chemically erased her past. But the trauma remained buried in her subconscious, surfacing in nightmares she couldn't understand. Margaret was finally released from Blackwood in late 1972 at age 15. Her memories fractured. Her trust shattered. Her childhood stolen. But she'd survived. And somehow, against all odds, she'd built a life anyway. Jesus Christ, Gary whispered. Father Dominic was crying openly now. Nate ejected the tape, held it in his hands. This was the evidence that would have freed Margaret. The proof that she'd been telling the truth all along. But no one had listened. No one had believed her. Until Lorelei. His daughter had found this tape, had heard her grandmother's voice, had understood what had been done to her. And it had cost Lorelei her life. Nate stood abruptly. I need air. He climbed the stairs, walked out into the morning light. The grounds of Stone Cottage were overgrown, weeds and wild grass, nature reclaiming what humans had abandoned. He walked to the edge of the property, looked out at the mountains. Margaret should have lived to see this, should have lived to know that the truth came out, that she'd been right all along. But she died thinking no one believed her, died carrying the weight of false guilt for memories that were real. Nate's phone rang. Agent Torres. Mr. Brennan, wanted to update you. Philip Caldwell was arraigned this morning. Pleaded guilty to all charges, no trial. He waived all appeals. Why would he do that? His lawyer says he wants to die with some shred of dignity intact. Thinks a guilty plea shows remorse. Does it? Doesn't matter to me. He's going to federal prison for whatever time he has left. 6 months. Maybe less. The cancer's aggressive. Nate said nothing. There's something else, Torres continued. We found more victims, people who saw the news coverage and came forward. 15 so far. All with stories similar to what we found in the Blackwood files. How many of them are still alive? 8. The others died years ago. Suicide mostly. A few drug overdoses, one car accident that, looking at it now, might not have been an accident. More bodies, more lives destroyed. What happens to them? We're setting up a victims' compensation fund. It's not much. Can't undo what was done. But it's something. Money doesn't fix trauma. No. But it acknowledges it. Sometimes that matters. Nate thanked her. Ended the call. Gary appeared beside him. Heard that. More victims. Always more. This kind of evil doesn't stay contained. They stood in silence, watching the sun climb higher. "What are you going to do with this place?" Gary asked. "I don't know. Lorelei bought it, left it to me. But I can't keep it, can't sell it, can't just walk away. The survivors want to turn it into a memorial, a place to remember what happened here, to make sure it never happens again." Nate considered that. Would people come? People come to Auschwitz, to the 9/11 memorial, to every place where terrible things happened, not to celebrate the horror, to witness it, to make sure it's not forgotten. Stone Cottage Memorial, for institutional abuse victims, something like that. With the archive, the files, the tapes, all of it preserved, accessible to researchers, journalists, anyone who wants to understand how systems fail the people they're supposed to protect. Nate nodded slowly. Lorelei would have liked that. "Your daughter was building something important. We should finish it." Over the next month, Nate worked with the survivors to create a plan. Stone Cottage would be preserved, not as it was now abandoned and rotting, but as a living archive, a testament. The basement would house the documents, the patient files, the audio tapes, the video evidence. The upper floors would become exhibition space, telling the stories of the victims, showing what institutional abuse looked like, how it happened, why it was allowed to continue. And outside a memorial garden, names carved in stone. Every child who died at Blackwood, every survivor who'd carried the trauma. Margaret Caldwell Brennan, patient 447. Elliot Hartley, patient 438. Timothy Kowalski, patient 423. Rachel Morrison, patient 439. On and on. 47 names from the final years alone. Hundreds more from the decades before. Marcus Reeves led the fundraising effort. His story went viral. Successful businessman who'd overcome institutional abuse. Major donors responded. Money poured in. Sarah Kowalski organized the memorial committee, worked with architects, landscapers, historians. Father Dominic became the spiritual advisor, not offering platitudes or empty comfort, but bearing witness, sitting with survivors as they told their stories, holding space for their pain. And Gary oversaw construction, made sure every detail honored the victims, made sure their stories were told accurately. Nate spent his days in the archive, listening to tapes, reading files, writing summaries. Each patient deserved to have their story told, their voice heard. He worked methodically, the same way he'd worked cold cases, building profiles, establishing timelines, finding patterns. But this was different from police work. This wasn't about solving crimes. It was about honoring lives. Late one night, 6 weeks into the project, Nate sat alone in Margaret's old room. The room had been preserved exactly as it was when she'd been a patient. Small bed, metal frame, thin mattress, a single window with bars. He could imagine her here, 8 years old, confused, scared, calling for her father who'd betrayed her. The walls still bore faint marks, scratches, as if someone had clawed at them. Margaret had lived here for 7 years, from age 8 to 15, in this tiny room, drugged, isolated, told repeatedly that her mind was broken. How had she survived it? How had she emerged capable of love, of building a life, of raising a daughter? Nate pulled out his phone, opened the photos, found one of Margaret from their wedding day. She'd been 40. He'd been 35. Late bloomers, both of them. She'd told him she wasn't sure she could marry, that she had too much damage, too many scars. He'd told her everyone had scars, that what mattered was choosing to love anyway. She'd cried at the altar, happy tears, she'd said. But now he wondered. Had she been thinking about this room, about the years stolen from her, about the childhood she'd never had? "I'm sorry," he whispered to the photo. "I'm sorry I didn't know. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from this." A sound behind him. He turned. Father Dominic stood in the doorway. "Thought I might find you here. Can't sleep." "Me neither. These walls, they're heavy with memory." The old priest sat on the bed. It creaked under his weight. "I used to come to this room when Margaret was a patient. She'd ask me questions about God, about why bad things happen to good people." "What did you tell her?" "I told her God worked in mysterious ways, that suffering had purpose." Father Dominic's voice was bitter. The standard platitudes, the easy answers that mean nothing. "What would you tell her now?" "That I was wrong, that there's no divine purpose in what happened to her, that it was evil, pure and simple, and that anyone who stood by and let it happen, including me, shares responsibility." Nate looked at him. "You were young, powerless. I was complicit. There's a difference between powerless and choosing not to use what power you have." Father Dominic met his eyes. "I could have reported it, gone to the media, the state board, anyone. Instead, I prayed and told myself that was enough. And now I'm old, dying, facing judgment of a different kind." He smiled sadly. "If there's a God, I'll have to answer for my silence. And no amount of late repentance will change that." They sat together in Margaret's room. Two old men, both carrying guilt that couldn't be absolved. "Why did you really come tonight?" Nate asked. "To give you something." Father Dominic pulled an envelope from his jacket. "I found this in the chapel archive. Letter Margaret wrote when she was 14. She gave it to me. Asked me to mail it. I told her I would." He handed it to Nate. "I never did. Kept it instead. Told myself I was protecting her. But really I was protecting the institution." Nate opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, a letter. Margaret's teenage handwriting. Careful, precise. "Dear whoever finds this, my name is Margaret Caldwell. I'm 14 years old. I've been at Blackwood Sanitarium for 6 years. They tell me I'm sick, that I see things that aren't real, that my memories are lies. But I know the truth. I saw my uncle kill 2 people. I told my father, and instead of believing me, he sent me here. I don't know how much longer I can fight. The medication makes everything fuzzy. I forget things, lose time. Sometimes I can't remember my own name, but I'm writing this while I still can, while I still remember. I saw Philip Caldwell murder Helen Morrison and her husband. I saw him standing in my father's study covered in blood. I heard him crying, saying he didn't mean to. This is real. I'm not crazy. Please believe me. If anyone finds this, please help me. Please tell someone. Please don't let them erase me. Margaret Caldwell. Patient. 4/47 April 1971. Nate read it 3 times. His wife. At 14. Begging for help that never came. Writing a message in a bottle and giving it to a priest who'd kept it hidden for 50 years. Why are you showing me this now? His voice was rough. Because you asked what I'd tell Margaret if I could. This is what I'd tell her. Father Dominic stood. I'd tell her I'm sorry. That I should have mailed her letter. That I should have believed her. That my failure to act was a sin I'll carry to my grave. He walked to the door, paused. But I'd also tell her that she was right. That she wasn't crazy. That her memories were real and true and brave. And that even though she didn't live to see it, the truth came out. People believed her. And her story will make sure this never happens to anyone else. Father Dominic left. Nate sat holding the letter. Margaret had fought. Even when they drugged her. Even when they told her she was insane. Even when everyone she trusted betrayed her. She'd fought. And she'd survived. Not whole. Not undamaged. But alive. She'd built a life anyway. Found love anyway. Became a mother anyway. Despite everything they'd done to her, she'd refused to disappear. That was courage. Real courage. Nate folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope. This would be displayed in the memorial. Margaret's own words, proof that she'd never stopped telling the truth. The grand opening of the Stone Cottage Memorial was scheduled for a year after Philip Caldwell's arrest. The old judge had died 4 months into his sentence. Cancer as predicted. He'd spend his final days in a prison hospital. No visitors, no calls, completely alone. Some people said it was fitting. Others said it was too easy. Nate thought it was just sad. An old man dying alone because he'd spent his entire life putting himself first. The memorial opened on a crisp October morning. The leaves were turning, gold and red against a blue sky. Hundreds of people came. Survivors. Family members of those who hadn't survived. Journalists, researchers, students. Nate stood at the entrance watching them arrive. Marcus Reeves spoke first, his voice strong, clear. We're here to remember, not to celebrate tragedy, but to witness it, to make sure the children who suffered and died in this place are never forgotten, to make sure the systems that failed them are held accountable. He gestured to the memorial garden behind him, names carved in black granite. Each of these names represents a life, a person who deserved protection and received punishment instead, who told the truth and were called liars, who sought help and were given harm. His voice broke slightly. My name is on that wall. Patient 451. I survived. Many didn't. And I carry that guilt every day. wondering why I lived when others died. What made me special? What made me strong enough? He paused. But I've learned something in the years since this story became public. I wasn't special. I wasn't strong. I was lucky. Lucky that I got out when I did. Lucky that the damage done to me wasn't permanent. Lucky that I found people who believe me, who help me rebuild. He looked at the crowd. Not everyone gets that luck. And that's why we're here. To create a world where kids don't need luck to be believed. Where telling the truth doesn't get you locked away. Where systems protect instead of harm. Sarah Kowalski spoke next, holding her brother's photo. Timothy was 12 when he died. He loved baseball, drawing. He wanted to be an artist. Instead, he's buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in these mountains. We don't even know where. They didn't keep records of the children they discarded. Tears ran down her face. I've spent my whole life angry. At the people who killed him. At the system that allowed it. At God for letting it happen. But anger doesn't bring him back. Doesn't give me another 50 years with my brother. She placed the photo on the memorial wall. So instead of anger, I choose remembrance. I choose to make sure his story is told. That his name is spoken. That he's not forgotten. She stepped back. Timothy Kowalski. Patient 423. My baby brother. Who deserved so much better than this world gave him. Father Dominic spoke last. I was the chaplain here. I saw what happened. I heard the screams. I prayed with children who were being tortured, and I did nothing to stop it. His voice was steady, unflinching. I told myself I was powerless, that speaking out would only get me removed, that my presence was better than nothing. But the truth is, I was a coward. I chose my comfort over their safety, and that makes me complicit. He looked at the memorial. I don't deserve forgiveness, don't want it. What I want is for people to understand that evil doesn't just happen. It's allowed. By people like me, who see wrong and do nothing, who value order over justice, who protect institutions instead of the vulnerable. He removed his priest's collar, set it on the memorial wall. I'm renouncing my ordination, not because the church requires it, but because I don't deserve to claim spiritual authority after what I allowed to happen here. Gasps from the crowd. My failure doesn't excuse the churches, doesn't excuse the doctors, doesn't excuse the families who sent their children here. But it's my failure, and I own it. He stepped back. The crowd was silent. Then slowly people began to move forward, placing flowers on the memorial, photos, letters, mementos. A woman placed a teddy bear. For my sister, patient 382. A man placed military dog tags. For my son, who survived this place but couldn't survive the trauma. One by one they came, bearing witness, honoring the dead, supporting the survivors. Nate watched from the side. He'd chosen not to speak. This wasn't his story to tell. But as the ceremony ended, Marcus approached him. You should say something about Lorelei, about Margaret. I don't know what to say. The truth. That's all anyone needs. Nate hesitated, then nodded. He walked to the memorial, faced the crowd. My name is Nathaniel Brennan. I'm a retired detective. For 40 years, I believed in the system, believed that law and order and following procedure would lead to justice. He paused. I was wrong. The admission felt like exhaling poison. My wife, Margaret, was a patient here. I didn't know. She never told me. Spent 22 years married to me and never once said what had been done to her. Why? Because I was a cop. Because she thought I'd never understand. That I'd defend the system that destroyed her. His voice cracked. She was right. I would have. Back then, I would have dismissed her story, told her to move on, to trust the authorities, to believe that the system worked. He looked at Margaret's name on the wall. My daughter Lorelei didn't make that mistake. When she found out what happened to her grandmother, she didn't trust the system. She investigated, documented, built an airtight case, and she died for it. Tears blurred his vision. I spent my whole life chasing justice, but I didn't understand what justice meant. I thought it was about following rules, filling out paperwork, trusting institutions. But real justice is about believing victims, holding power accountable, choosing people over procedures. He wiped his eyes. Lorelei understood that. Margaret understood that. They were braver than I ever was. And I'm standing here today because they refused to let the truth stay buried, even when it cost them everything. He placed 2 photos on the memorial wall. Margaret from their wedding day, Lorelei from her college graduation. To my wife and daughter, who taught me that courage isn't about wearing a badge. It's about speaking truth to power, even when no one wants to listen, even when it costs you everything, even when you know you might not live to see justice done. He stepped back. The crowd applauded, not celebratory, but acknowledging. Gary appeared at his side. Good speech. I meant every word. I know. They stood together watching people explore the memorial, reading names, listening to audio recordings, bearing witness. Do you think this matters? Nate asked. All of this, the memorial, the archive. Does it actually change anything? Gary considered. My brother's been dead 41 years. Nothing brings him back. Nothing fixes what was done to him. So in that sense, no. This doesn't change anything. He paused. But 15 new victims came forward because of this. 15 people who'd been carrying their trauma alone suddenly had witnesses, had validation, had proof they weren't crazy. That matters. Does it? Ask them. Nate looked at the crowd, saw survivors talking to each other, sharing stories, crying, embracing, creating community out of shared trauma. Maybe Gary was right. Maybe this did matter, not because it fixed the past, but because it acknowledged it. Not because it brought justice, but because it created space for truth. The memorial stayed open until sunset. As people left, Nate remained. He walked through the empty rooms, read the exhibits, listened to audio recordings. In Margaret's room, he found a display case. Inside her letter, the one she'd given Father Dominic, the plea for help that never came. Next to it, Lorelei's journal, open to the final entry. 2 generations, both fighting the same battle, both refusing to be silenced. Nate pressed his hand against the glass. I'm sorry I didn't protect you, either of you. I'm sorry I chose my badge over my family. I'm sorry I learned too late what really mattered. His voice echoed in the empty room. But I promise you this. Your story is told. Your truth is known. And I'll spend whatever time I have left making sure it stays that way. He stood there until the last light faded from the windows. Then he walked outside, locked the doors, got in his car, but he didn't drive back to Boston. Instead, he drove to the cemetery, to Margaret's grave. He hadn't visited since the funeral. Couldn't face it. But now he needed to. The headstone was simple. Margaret Caldwell Brennan, beloved wife and mother, 1957 to 2019. It didn't mention Blackwood. Didn't mention patient 447. Didn't mention the 7 years stolen from her. Nate knelt beside the grave. I know the truth now. All of it. What they did to you. How you fought. How brave you were. He placed flowers on the stone. Lorelei found it. She finished what you couldn't. And she died making sure everyone knew you were telling the truth all along. The wind picked up. Leaves scattered across the grass. I wish I'd known. Wish you'd trusted me enough to tell me. But I understand why you didn't. I was part of the system that destroyed you. How could you trust me? He wiped his eyes. I'm trying to be better. Trying to be the man you deserved. The father Lorelei needed. I know it's too late. But I'm trying anyway. He sat there until the cemetery closed. Until the caretaker gently told him it was time to leave. On the drive back to Boston, Nate's phone rang. Agent Torres. Mr. Brennan, wanted to let you know. We've identified 3 more victims. Blackwood patients from the 1970s, all willing to testify if we find more perpetrators still alive. How many are left of the people who funded Blackwood 12 that we know of? Most in their 80s and 90s. We're building cases. Slowly. But building them. Will there be prosecutions? Some. Maybe. If we move fast. If they live long enough. If their lawyers don't bury us in motions. So much uncertainty. So little guarantee. Is it worth it? Nate asked. Chasing these old men, they'll die before seeing justice. You tell me. You chased Philip Caldwell. That was different. How? Nate didn't have an answer. Mr. Brennan, I've worked cold cases my entire career. You know what I've learned? Justice isn't about punishment. It's about acknowledgement. When we arrest a 90-year-old man for crimes committed 50 years ago, we're not doing it because prison will reform him. We're doing it because it tells survivors that what happened to them mattered, that their pain was real, that someone cares enough to hold people accountable. She paused. So yes, it's worth it. Every case, every prosecution, every old man we drag into court. Because it tells victims they weren't forgotten. Nate thanked her. ended the call. She was right, of course. This work mattered, not because it fixed anything, but because it acknowledged the harm. He drove back to his apartment, climbed the stairs, unlocked the door. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it. Empty. Quiet. But it felt different now. Because he had a purpose again. Not chasing criminals. Not solving cases. But honoring the dead by refusing to let them be forgotten. He went to his desk, opened his laptop, started writing. Not a report. Not a case file. A book. The Stone Cottage. A daughter's investigation into institutional abuse. He'd tell Lorelei's story. Margaret's story. Every victim's story. Not for fame, not for money, but because stories were how truth survived. How the dead spoke to the living. How history learned from its mistakes, or tried to anyway. Nate wrote through the night, the words flowing faster than they had in years. He wrote about Margaret's childhood, her courage, her survival. He wrote about Lorelei's investigation, her determination, her sacrifice. He wrote about Blackwood, about the children who died, the survivors who carried trauma. And he wrote about failure, his own, Father Dominic's, Gary's, society's, the collective failure that allowed places like Blackwood to exist. By dawn, he had 50 pages. It wasn't enough, would never be enough. But it was a start. 6 months later, the book was finished. Publishers wanted it. A major house offered a substantial advance. Nate accepted, but donated every penny to the Stone Cottage Memorial Foundation. The book was released on the anniversary of Lorelei's death. It became a bestseller overnight, not because people wanted scandal, but because they recognized themselves in the story. How many people carried trauma from institutions that had failed them? How many had been told they were crazy when they were telling the truth? How many had watched authority figures protect each other instead of protecting the vulnerable? The book gave them language, validation, proof they weren't alone. Nate did interviews, podcasts, speaking tours, always focusing on the victims, never on himself. This was their story. He was just the messenger. 1 year after the memorial opened, Nate returned to Stone Cottage. The place had changed, no longer abandoned and rotting, but alive with purpose. School groups toured the exhibits. Researchers studied the archives. Survivors held monthly support meetings. The memorial garden was full of flowers. Hundreds of names. Thousands of visitors each month. Gary met him at the entrance. How does it feel? Like we did something right. Finally, they walked through the grounds together. 2 old men, both carrying less weight than before. Not healed, but healing. I got a letter yesterday, Gary said, from a woman in Oregon. Said her grandfather was a patient here in 1968. Patient 315. Died age 9. She'd never known what happened to him, just that he'd been sent away and never came back. He pulled the letter from his pocket. She thanked us, said finding his name on the memorial gave her family closure. that they finally knew his story, that he hadn't just disappeared. Gary's eyes were wet. That's why we did this, for letters like that. Nate nodded. They stood at Margaret's name, Patient 447. She'd be proud of you, Gary said. Think so. I know so. You honored her story, made sure she wasn't forgotten. That's all any of us can ask for. Nate placed a hand on the carved stone, felt the cool granite under his palm. I miss her. Every day. Even knowing what I know now. Even understanding why she couldn't tell me. I miss her. Love doesn't stop just because you learn hard truths. No, it doesn't. They stood in silence, the autumn wind rustling leaves around them. Finally, Nate spoke. What do you think happens next? After we're gone, does this place survive? Does the story continue? Gary considered. I think the survivors will keep it alive as long as they can. Then the next generation will take over. Researchers, historians, people who care about making sure this never happens again. And if they don't care, then we failed. But I don't think we will. Stories like this, they have staying power. They matter too much to disappear. Nate hoped he was right. As the sun set, he walked back to his car. But before leaving, he made one final stop. Lorelei's memorial stone. Not in the patient garden, but in a separate section. For those who'd fought to expose the truth. Her name. Her dates. And beneath them, words Nate had chosen carefully. She asked the questions no one wanted to answer, and died making sure the truth survived. He knelt beside it. You were right, Lore, about everything. About Mom, about me, about the system. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand. He placed flowers on the stone, but I understand now. And I'm trying to be the father you deserved, the man who listens, who believes, who chooses people over procedures. The wind carried his words away. I hope that's enough. I hope you can forgive me. I hope you know how proud I am of you. He stood slowly, his knees protesting, age catching up with him. I'll finish your work. Keep your memory alive. Make sure your sacrifice mattered. He walked to his car, started the engine. As he drove away from Stone Cottage, Nate looked in the rearview mirror. The house stood against the darkening sky, no longer haunted, no longer hiding secrets, just a building, holding space for truth. That was enough. Some stories didn't have happy endings. Some wounds never fully healed. Some justice came too late to save anyone. But truth mattered anyway. Acknowledgement mattered. Bearing witness mattered. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to make sure the next generation did better. Nate drove through the Vermont darkness toward home. Behind him, Stone Cottage stood sentinel. A monument to failure. A promise to do better. A place where the ghosts finally rested. Not because they were forgotten, but because at last they were believed.